Okay, it was always it's a bit of a nervous moment to be here and speaking at the Cathie Marsh lecture as someone who's been in the audience many times myself. And when I got the invitation from the committee to do this year's lecture, my first thought was, well, yes, I'll have to do that. I mean, who turns down, if you're in my kind of role, who turns down this kind of offer? My second thought was, shit, what am I going to say that's going to be sufficiently interesting? I can't do my usual, just here's a problem, here's some data, here's what we found, and off we go. You're expecting a panoramic view of the past and the future and so on. So that I was a bit worried about this, but fortunately the committee actually gave me a question that they wanted me to address, and so I thought that the simplest thing here is then just to be a sort of like a good undergraduate doing an essay, just to answer the question that's given to you. So that's what I'm going to try and do today. And in doing that, in approaching this question as a good undergraduate student would, the first thing that I have to do is to think about the key concepts in the question. Of course, key to this is going to be surveys and polls. What do we mean? What's the distinction between a survey and a poll? We use these words sometimes interchangeably, sometimes to distinguish between different sorts of things. So I need to be a bit clear, I think, at the outset, what the differences are between, if any, between a poll and a survey. It also occurred to me, as I was preparing for this, that I should probably do a bit of research on Cathie Marsh, the person whose name this annual lecture is named in memory of. And I'm very glad that I did. It wasn't one of the books that you had, Jill, but I managed to find this one. Actually, it's out of print now, which is a great shame, I think. But I managed to find a copy on Amazon, and it really. There are many differences. Of course, the context is very different. She's writing this in the early 80s, when there was a conservative government dismantling the welfare state. There were pressures on survey budgets. There was a left-wing leader of the Labour Party criticised for his scruffy clothes. So it's a very different kind of context that she was operating in, but nonetheless, many things still very relevant today. And actually, one of the things that was a real pleasant surprise was that one of the things that she talks about a lot in this book is what the difference between polls and surveys are. So this was a fortunate thing that I decided to do. There are other very good things about this book. One of them is that there's an excellent history of the kind of survey research in Britain, going back to the sort of early roots in Victorian philanthropy. I haven't read a better one. And there's also a very good defence of survey methodology. You really get the sense that she's passionate about surveys, and I suppose most of the people in this room probably, over your careers, you get the brickbats from people who think that surveys are in one way or another terrible, but not many people have actually sort of sat down and written a cogent defence, and Cathie does that in this book, and it's well worth a read. So, to this question of what are polls and what are surveys, drawing on Cathie Marsh's discussion of this question, I mean, in many ways it doesn't really matter, does it? I mean, these are definitional matters that we can get on perfectly well without having a clear definition. But on one hand, we can differentiate between them in terms of, well, it's just kind of, polls are what pollsters do. There's Martin Boone, I think, you'd be in the front there being a pollster. I'm an academic. We do different kinds of activities, and we can sort of identify them as being somewhat different. There's a nice quote from Cathie's book here, which is, the distinction between a survey and a poll is sometimes made by academics to elevate the status of their activities by gracing them with a Latin root word as opposed to an Anglo-Saxon one. Which is originally attributed to Howard Schumann. But there is an element of snootiness, perhaps, about what we do is somewhat more elevated than a mere poll. There is another angle, which of course is the methodological one, which is that polls tend to be lower quality, tend to be thought of as certainly lower quality, cheaper, non-random. Surveys are high quality methodology done by academics and government statisticians and so on. Face-to-face methodologies, not so much current in polling these days. And thirdly, and this is something that Cathie Marsh puts a lot of emphasis on, is the differences of their uses, if you like. So that polls, she talks about being really about kind of democracy, and that can be both a good and a bad thing. We can use it to find out what the public thinks in more accurate ways than we might have done in the past, but it can of course also be used as a sort of lobbying tool to build a false consensus. We know that we can ask questions in certain ways that make public opinion appear to be stronger in one direction than another, and she contrasts this with surveys which are about more explanation, understanding and so on. And I'm summarising and paraphrasing probably rather badly. But actually all of these have problems. Of course, increasingly these days, pollsters do work for academics. The British election study is partly conducted by YouGov. A lot of the pollsters are commissioned to do work by academics and third sector organisations. And so that kind of distinction, I think, is probably a bit more fluid than it was in the past. Again, for the same reason, the sorts of explanatory models that we might have only seen done by academics using the British election study is now increasingly applied in sort of quota, online panel type of context. So I think that these distinctions are perhaps a little less rigid than they were in the past. But again, that's something that Cathie says in her discussion of this, is that these are ideal types. We can still see that when we talk about a poll, there's probably a little bit of each of these in our emphasis if we're differentiating a poll from a survey. So that's important, because if I'm going to be answering this question, what does the 2015 polling miss? What does it portend for the future of surveys? What I'm really saying is, what does it portend for the future of the kinds of surveys that I tend to be involved with, and that many of you in this room tend to be involved with if you're working in government and so on. The sort of the British election study face-to-face component, the crime survey, the time use survey, these things that still involve knocking on doors and getting high response rates and so on. Okay, so the 2015 election polls. This is the thing that I think probably is of most interest to you, and as Jill said, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to say anything very much about what we've been finding so far. We have a meeting in this room on the 19th of January, which if there are any spaces left, you're very welcome to come to. But I am going to say a bit about what the polls showed and where they went wrong. So this may be an image that many of you remember. I think it's certainly see it. There's a kind of a flashbulb memory aspect to many people I talked to about the moment they found out the exit poll. I certainly remember exactly what I was doing when someone texted me and said, "Is that really right?" And I thought, I know Yoni Kuhar is the person who's behind that, and so I'm pretty confident that these numbers are going to stack up. And indeed they did. But there was a huge element of surprise, and I think that's a really important thing, and I come back to that when we're trying to assess what went wrong. This massive element of surprise, I think, has influenced the way that we have assessed the error in the polls. So what did the polls show? Here's a chart, and we've got on the left bar in each case is the average of the final polls amongst the BPC polling members, of which there are 9, I think. And so the 34 bar on the left is the sort of the poll of polls, what the vote share for the Conservative Party was amongst the pollsters, and then to the right of that is the actual GB vote share. So if we think about this for a minute, and I think one of the first things that you need to recognise here is that if you look at the right side of the chart, things look very good. Okay, so the pollsters got it, right on the money when we're talking about UKIP, when we're talking about the Lib Dems. The Greens are pretty accurate. What's not shown here is also the SNP. These were all things that were pretty much new in this election. Okay, so if we're making an assessment of how the pollsters did in 2015, we have to recognise that it's more complex than just saying they got it wrong. Okay, now that isn't to say that there was a bad error, and what led to this, that was the big shock. But there's more to the polling than just that headline, albeit that's the most important one. So, but despite the fact that they got that right, and I'd add, anyone out there who thinks that they can do a better job than this with Twitter data or Facebook or whatever, then be my guest. I think this is still, polls are still really the only show in town. But where things went wrong, of course, is on the levels for the two parties, and the fact that the levels were both wrong in the wrong direction. And so the key estimate, which is the lead of the Conservatives over Labour, is badly out by around 6-7%. Okay, so depending on the pollster. So what this meant was translating this into well, it's not translating that, but the seat shares. Again, another big surprise. Actually, this was beyond the prediction of the exit poll. And actually, the exit poll didn't give the Conservatives an overall majority. They were nearly there, but actually, they, of course, achieved an overall majority of 12. Okay, so another big surprise. Nowhere better illustrated, I think, than in this picture of people eating various bits of clothing, unfortunately in the form of cake, which I think is a bit of a cop-out. But actually, this does, of course, suggest that this is a rather, flippant activity, and there's another debate to be had there, and I think Jill's going to pick up on that in her comments, which is, what is the function of polling in a society? We perhaps endow it with more of a, if you like, a democratic function than it merits or wants. That's something that we can return to. But on the other hand, here's a different view to that, and one that was published in an editorial in The Guardian the following week. And what this is the point that's being made here is that the polling evidence, what the polling shows, is driving the reporting and is driving the kinds of questions that are being asked of the parties and the politicians, and that, let's say, if the polls had been correct in the lead up, that is showing a big Conservative lead, then the questions wouldn't have been about the SNP Labour alliance. They would have been more about the huge cuts to come down the line. So it might have influenced the result. Therefore, that does make them very consequential. Now, again, I mean, something we may come back to. That doesn't mean that if we didn't have the polls, people wouldn't be speculating about what the result was, and they may be even more inaccurate about that, and that's something to bear in mind. But this also has resulted in a private members' bill for regulation of the polling industry, which is put forward by Lord Fawkes, and I think is actually due to have its committee stage on Friday, so this is still sort of rumbling along. I think the chances of this being passed are vanishingly small, but you can see that it is something which attracts not just academic but political interest. So, how bad was the miss? I mean, in some ways I've said it wasn't so bad because some of the party shares were bang on. But to get a better sense of how bad the miss was, I think we need to take a bit of a historical perspective and look back over previous elections. So here's a chart. I've got to state my gratitude to my Southampton colleague Will Jennings, who spends his spare time collecting historical polls and putting them into statistical databases and analysing them. And I benefit from this by getting these great historical charts. So Will has produced this one. This is all the poles. It's kind of like the pole of poles that I showed you a moment ago. So each of the dots is the average of the final weekly polls that were conducted for each election, and that number varies and so on. And that goes back to 1945. And you can see the 0 in the middle of the y-axis there. That's where you want to be if you're a pollster. And if you're above the line, you're overestimating the Conservative share, and if you're below the 0, you're underestimating. And you can see actually there is this kind of trend, historical trend, which we've observed and has been seen in a number of elections recently around the world, tendency to underestimate the sort of right-wing parties. There are a couple of exceptions to that. But the general trend has been, the general tendency has been to underestimate the Conservative vote share, as was indeed the case in 2015. And it's also important to recognise here that polling methods, methods aren't staying constant throughout this, right? There's a lot of change underlying this in the way that polls are done, and also the pollsters are seeing this tendency and they're changing their methods to try and adjust up, voting by or weighting by past vote and those kinds of procedures, which are trying to take some account of this tendency to underestimate the Conservatives. Here's the same chart for Labour. It's a bit more scattered, but again, the general tendency is to overestimate Labour, and here we can see actually the 2010 was the last election was a bit of an anomaly there, where most surveys and polls underestimated the Labour share. Here's the important one, the mean absolute error on the lead. 1945 to 2015. I think what I want to point out here is a few things. One is that, as Nick Moon, who's in the back there, pointed out before the election, so this was actually some kind of a prediction, I guess, was that these big misses tend to happen every 20 years. Okay, so we were expecting this in some way or other. But the other thing to say is that here's 2015, okay, and this is 1992, the other big debacle. So this isn't, in historical terms, this isn't the worst. We knew that, but actually, if you just look at this, if you look at this spread of points before this one joins in, and you were looking at this and you're saying, now how unlikely is it that we're going to see something around here, given this historical spread? You wouldn't be that surprised. It's certainly not on. It's on the outer margin, but it's certainly within the historical spread of errors. Okay, and so I think one of the issues that I've been thinking about, this is in a personal capacity rather than the panel, is perhaps we over endow polls in their ability to be precise. We're using something that weighs in pounds to measure ounces or something of that nature, that there is good reason why these have these kinds of errors. Again, we'll come back to that. So here's actually the final poll estimates across the different pollsters, and you can see that while there's some difference this is the Conservative vote share prediction, and this is one at the bottom here is the actual vote share underlined. There's some variability in the level for both the Conservatives and the Labour shares, but what's really interesting is I think that this is the only one panel base that's more than 1 percentage point different. Most of them are 0 difference or 1 percentage point, and even this one is in the wrong direction, right? So they're all, and this I think was what led to this flashbulb moment for so many people. We weren't expecting it. Everything was telling us it was going to be a dead heat and a hung parliament. So, who done it? This is the inquiry that I was asked to chair the morning after the election, and again, it's very pleased and honoured to take that on. And my strategy has been to surround myself with a bunch of people who are very smart and hardworking, who will find all the answers, and then I will take all the credit at the end. And it's going well so far. So, but there is an element of a kind of, a whodunit to this. We've got the suspects, the hypotheses. There is sort of limited number, a finite number of possible explanations. We think that we've tracked down all the potential suspects, and we've broken up into teams, and we are looking at them in turn. So here are the suspects. The first is late swing, and this is, some of these are going to be the pollsters' friends, if you like. This is going to be more palatable if we find late swing, I think, than some of the other ones. So late swing is when people, and we're slightly taking a slightly different set of definitions to how previous reports have looked at some of these phenomena. So we hope we're tightening up some of the definitions where there's been a bit of looseness in the past. So late swing we're defining as people switching parties. So and that's from your final poll vote intention. You say you're going to vote UKIP, and you go into the polling booth and you vote Labour, okay, or whatever. So it's switching between parties. Now this is plausible, of course. There was quite a lot of uncertainty leading up to the actual election day. There was the whole business about the SNP Labour alliance that was getting UKIP supporters and others nervous. There was a lack of confidence in Miliband, I think, around economic competence. And so it's certainly plausible that between the final time that people were polled and when they actually were in the voting booth, they changed disproportionately back to the Conservatives. Okay, so that's something that we are going to be looking at. We have some data. Again, something else I should say about the way things have worked so far is that the pollsters have all been very helpful, very transparent, and have provided data that we've asked for and additional explanatory information that we've gone back for, which is in marked contrast to the way that things have gone in other countries in similar inquiries. So we're very glad about that. So we've got some data to look at. As ever, the data is imperfect. We are going to be talking about balances of probabilities rather than this definitely happened, this definitely didn't happen. Another suspect is sampling and weighting. It's about how the pollsters draw their samples. Now, I talked at the start about the difference between polls and surveys. The way that someone like me tends to do surveys is by drawing random samples. You have a sample design, known selection probabilities. If you've got 100% response rate, everything's fine. You apply your design weights and you'll recover in expectation the true population value. These polls don't work according to the same rationale. They're essentially modelling exercises based on recruited samples. That varies a bit depending on whether you're talking about, that's more the case for the online polls than it is for the phone polls, but these are different from the way that we would recruit for standard surveys. And in the 92 inquiry, this was one of the things that was found to be one of the problems, in which the pollsters then took some action and made changes in their methodology, that they weren't using appropriate quota schemes. They were kind of out of date in various ways, and they weren't strongly predictive of voting tendency, and that there was also a move at that time towards more phone polling and away from people standing on a street corner with a clipboard. So we're looking at sampling, way that samples are generated, and we're looking at, of course, the way that they don't just report the raw data, there are lots of decisions that have to be taken about matching these samples up to known population totals, dealing with people who, whether they say they're going to vote definitely or not, and so on. There's various things that have to be decided upon, and they can be consequential. As I said, there's the turnout issue is someone like me coming to this. I'm not a pollster. I've never really looked at polls too much, but when I looked at what the nature of the problem is, I was more surprised that they get close to the result than that they are some distance from it, because it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. Not least because you can only draw samples of the population. You don't know what the population of voters is going to be prior to the election. So you have to ask people, how likely are you to vote? And people are not perfect reporters of whether they are going to vote. It may be that they have perfectly good intentions to, but something happens that stops them, or maybe they want to say that they're going to vote even though they're not, and so on. And so there are very difficult decisions that you have to make, different ways that you can ask the question about likelihood to vote, and so on. I'm trying to think how I'm going to keep a track of the time here. Is that clock correct? This seems to be wrong on the timing here. It started a long time ago. Okay, so, yeah. Okay, I better speed up a bit. Okay, and another thing is, a lot of people don't tell the pollsters, who they're going to vote for. Up to sort of the 20% will say, I'm not going to tell you, or I don't know. And if those people, when they actually go to vote, if they do go to vote, if they break disproportionately for one party, again, that's going to skew the results that you've got in terms of prediction. Something else that's interesting is that, after the event, there were various people who came forward and kind of said in one way or another, actually, I did get it right. I just didn't tell people for one reason or another. One of these was the Labour internal polling had apparently been pretty much on target. Although we didn't see any of the actual numbers, or let alone the data, the explanation for this was that the way the question was asked was first primed by questions about the parties and so on, so this gave a better estimate. But it's certainly plausible that the way that questions are asked can have an influence on vote intention. We know that's true, so there is variation in the way that the different pollsters ask the question. Some of them ask squeeze questions to get down that don't know group, so they'll try things like, if it were compulsory, you say I don't know, then you say, well, if it were compulsory, who would you vote for, and things like that. So we'll be looking at all of that. And lastly, of course, there's the issue of voter registration, postal voting, overseas voting. This is unlikely, I think, to be of any relevance because this is very small numbers of people in terms of the total, but we will also be looking at that. Now, just to return to this chart and the consensus. I mean, this is something else that we're going to be looking at this time that wasn't looked at in previous inquiries, which is, it's really kind of surprising. I mean, even if these were all using exactly the same methods, statistically we would expect a bigger distribution of the estimate of the difference. The fact that they're all coming up with the same estimate is kind of odd, particularly if they're actually using rather different methods, which they are. So this is a phenomenon which has been identified previously as herding. Here's a set-piece joke that I put in earlier. So the idea here is that they are either intentionally or subconsciously agreeing on what the outcome is going to be, and when they're having to make all these difficult decisions about what do we do with the don't knows, what about the likelihood to vote, pulling these levers and eventually all coming to the same answer. Now, my view on this, there has been some kind of lurid stuff in the media about this. My view is that it's almost certainly going to be, if it exists, we don't know whether it's happening or not. The raw numbers suggest it could be, but if it is happening, it's much more likely to be people just trying to predict an uncertain number. They've got lots of things that they can do that will make that number go up and down, and when they do some of them, and they look at the number that they get and it looks implausible, then they think, well, maybe I shouldn't do that, maybe I should do this. And where does that sense of plausibility come from? Well, it comes from the other pollsters. So there doesn't need to be anything intentional about this at all. In fact, from the way that we know humans respond to uncertainty, it would actually be a kind of expected outcome in some cases. Now, of course, it's not going to necessarily explain the polling miss, because it's about variability rather than getting the point estimate wrong. It could explain the miss if they were all herding towards 0 as the lead, but that is a speculation. We don't know what the underlying herding mechanism is, if there is one, but we're going to be looking at that. So what are the implications of this? As I said, I can't report anything that we found so far, but I can consider, we know that the polls got it wrong, and of course the polls are very much the public face of survey research. This is where the public are come into contact with surveys. In fact, one of the upsides of it, one of the good sides, is I've never come across so many people who are interested in survey research. I spend a lot of time trying to interest people, students and normal people, in the pub. This is amazing that we can do this. We can take a sample and we can estimate this quantity, and then boring. But as soon as there's a polling miss, everyone's you're doing that polling inquiry. Everyone's got a theory. It's usually the same one. It's usually shy Tories and the people lie to pollsters. That's what the sort of lay theory of the polling miss. But it's good in that sense, I suppose. It gets people thinking about survey methods. On the potentially damaging side is that it can hurt trust, perhaps. If people think that these methods are all the same, then the crime statistics and RPI and all these other things that rely on surveys are going to be wrong. That's a quote there from Cathie Marsh, which nicely, I think, encapsulates that point. And there have been speculations about negative effects on response rates. Again, because people don't trust these things, they think that those polls were wrong, and it could harm trust and response rates. So there is certainly prima facie reason to think that there could be consequences. And we certainly know, again, from history, sorry, I've got to talk a lot about history because my dad's come here today and he's a historian, so I thought I'd be remiss if I didn't include a bit of history. But we know this is very famous in the development of survey methods. Famous polling misses or accurate estimates in the past, and here's probably the most famous one of all, the 1936 Roosevelt-Landon election. And actually one of the reasons why it was so famous, you can't read this here, but it's election will test competing polling methods, it says. And this is because George Gallup was going around at the time saying, I'm going to get this right, and the Literary Digest is going to get it wrong with all its huge sample size and so on. So, and indeed he did get it right with his small sample, small but carefully designed sample compared to the millions in the badly designed Literary Digest sample. And that was a kind of a break, although he wasn't as accurate as some of the other pollsters, but it shows you the benefits of self-promotion even in those days. But it was important in developing survey methods, in people realising that it's more important what the small sample is like than having very large numbers, a lesson that we do seem to be in danger of forgetting again these days. Here's another one, Dewey Truman, 1948. This actually was important in moving from the quota methods that had been employed by Gallup up to that point to moving to more random sampling and random digit dialing in the US in particular. And in our
our own context, of course, the 92 polling miss resulted. I wouldn't want to overemphasise that there were huge changes. Certainly not to survey methodology very generally, but I think to the way that polls were conducted, there were some changes that were affected after that miss. So polling misses they're high profile, and they can have consequences certainly for the polling industry and also for wider survey methodology. But I think, here's my conclusion, getting to it before the end of the essay, I think the effect of the polling miss in 2015 is going to be at most minimal. And why do I think that? Well, I think one of the reasons is, as I've been sort of intimating, is that election results are very difficult to estimate, forecast. I mean, we know that these aren't really forecasts, they're estimates of how people think they're going to vote in the future, but by the day before the election, they're getting pretty close to estimates. So they're very difficult to estimate, because what do we teach our students about doing surveys? Well, we should ask questions of carefully drawn samples of well-defined populations, about well-defined behaviours, hopefully, that makes it easier, that they've already done during a well-defined reference period. Okay, so an archetypal question that would be easier on the difficulty scale would be something like, in the past 7 days, that is, starting from, did you do any paid work? I think that is a much easier question. We're asking about something in the past, and our target population is all adults in Great Britain, the sort of thing that we would have in the labour force survey or something of that nature. Whereas polls ask about behaviour that's going to happen in the future, that is, again, subject to social desirability bias and other factors that may, privacy and so on. People may not want to reveal this private act of voting. And it's of a poorly defined population at that point in time, likely voters. Okay, so I think it would, and this is interestingly a conclusion that the 1948 inquiry in the US came to, which was we shouldn't judge polls in general or surveys in general from their failure to predict an election, because this is so bloody difficult. It really is on the high end of the difficulty scale for estimating population quantities. The other thing is that actually there weren't many random surveys. There certainly weren't any random polls that I'm aware of. If anyone's aware of them, please let us know. I don't think there were any. But in terms of random-ish designs, we know that the exit poll kind of got it more or less right. There's a big caveat there, or at least two big caveats. One is that now we're not asking about likely voters. These are people who've come out of the election booth. We're asking them about a behaviour that's just happened, and it isn't fully random because the constituencies are selected purposively, but it is still a random sample of people coming out of a poll. That got it broadly right. You probably saw some of you will have seen the British Election Study have released some data about their post-election survey, and there was a write-up in The Guardian about that last week. Again, not quite the same thing, because this is asking people who you voted for after the election. And of course, the good gag about academics can always get it right after the election. And here is the distribution for the British Election Survey. It's not perfect, actually. I mean, we can see they're off on most of the parties. They're off on the vote shares, but not by a huge amount. And broadly, they get the lead right. Okay. Now, I think this is personally, I think this is too early. There's not enough evidence here to say that it's about random, non-random. From one random survey, but they've done some digging into the data which shows some more tantalising evidence, and so there could be something. And certainly, if you wanted to defend the random approach, the two examples of random surveys which have asked about the election have got things broadly right. There's another one due to come out soon, I think. There are some people from NatSen here. I think the British Social Attitude Survey did ask about reported votes. So that'll be interesting when that data is available to see whether the same kinds of patterns are evident as for the British election survey. So the idea that this is going to be a big disruptive event for the random surveys, well, maybe not. Of course, the other thing is that there are huge differences in these kinds of these polls and surveys. We talked about what's the difference between a poll and a survey. Well, the methodology is increasingly differentiating. All of the polls were either phone or online. None of them use strict random sampling procedures. All of the online panels are, completely non-random. Here's an interesting stat here, I think, that the proportion of the polls in 2015, 80% of them online panels, and that's from 0. I think that's right. Maybe someone can correct me. I don't think YouGov started until after 2001. So I don't think any were online in 2001 to 80% in 2015. So is using non-random methods, and this is, I think, something that's worth concentrating on, is the growth of these opt-in panels. This is clearly something which does have implications for survey research, because they are the new kid in town. They are huge. You can see here this market share graph that I stole from Mario there. He said that was okay. I told you I'd given you an acknowledgement there. But you can see this is a massively upward trending in terms of, this is market research, but I think the same is true in all sorts of sectors. So there's enormous growth in market share. They're very low cost. Okay, there are many advantages of these panels. I don't know what the true number is here for a complete interview. How much does it cost per interview? What, a sample size of 1,000 from YouGov? Is it going to cost 5,000 quid? I don't know. It depends how long the interview is. Probably less. Yeah, nothing. I won't repeat that. It's low. We can come back to this in the discussion. Very low cost. Rapid turnaround of data. Get it almost pretty much same day. There are all sorts of things that you can do in addition to that you wouldn't be able to do usually. Multimedia, mobile functionality. Another good thing about it is, when I were a lad, you couldn't really be involved in getting your own survey, designing your own survey, unless you were going to do some really low quality thing amongst students in the university. So now graduate students can can design questions and think about experiments in their data and so on. So it does open up access, I think, to people to get involved in doing surveys. And they've had a good amount of prediction success, although obviously that the record has been a bit tainted of late. And one of the things that's interesting to reflect on here is this: the extremely low cost of these things is resulting in potential for sort of poll overload. Do we need this many polls? We had 91 polls in the short campaign, and those are just the published ones. I mean, I'm assuming that there are many, many more going on for the parties and so on that are unpublished. Lord Ashcroft, of course, doing his constituency polls a bit further out, 61 of those this time. And I think this is a great stat, actually, again from Will Jennings, which is between the two elections, 2010 to 2015, about 2,000 polls were undertaken. That compares to 3,500 between 1945 and 2010. Okay, so we often say exponential growth, but I think that actually is exponential growth, at least when we get the next data point. But so there are many good things about these. Cheapness is great, rapid turnaround, functionality, but are they very accurate? Well, I think the evidence suggests that, and it's growing, is that they aren't as accurate as random surveys. Here's a chart from a well-known paper by Jaeger et al. in Public Opinion Quarterly, and this is the average absolute error across a whole bunch of variables. And the key thing to notice here, sorry, try not to pull this down, is that these are all opt-in panels, and this is a random telephone, random internet survey. So there's not even a face-to-face random option here. We might expect that to be a bit down here. But the key point is that these bars are bigger than these ones and suggest that they're therefore less accurate. Here's another chart from Bob Aarons. Bob's in the audience here. Again, there's a lot of coloured bars going on here. The point to draw from this is that the coloured bars are all quite big, and that's bad. The one on the right is significant differences from the National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles, the one that Mrs. Thatcher closed down in the 80s. This is the third round of this happened recently. And so if you look at the online panels and how they compare, they're significantly different most of the time. And these are odds ratios for the size of the difference. So the differences are quite big, and they're significantly different compared to NatSal. I think this is pretty convincing. And there are more and more studies like this being done and showing that they vary widely. If you commission the same questionnaire to be administered amongst multiple providers, you get very different estimates for the same questions. It has to be said, we don't know what that would look like if we did it for multiple face-to-face surveys, because no one can ever afford to do that. But we suspect that there is a problem with accuracy. So you could take my point up to now to be saying that everything's fine with random surveys. Of course, that isn't the case. Here, sorry from NatSen colleagues here to pick out the BSA. It's one that's been done, pretty consistent methodology for a long time. Here's the response rate going down. Actually, that's when I joined NatSen. And you can see that's when I left, and there was a slight recovery here. But actually, to update this again, sorry, NatSen colleagues, that in 2014 has gone down to under 50%. So we know response rates are declining. We know that RDD is even worse now in the States, where it's more common, routinely below 10%. They've got even bigger problems there because now there's a legislation, you can't auto-dial mobiles, and more people are going to cell only. So increasingly, people who commission surveys are saying, what are we getting for our money? We're getting these response rates of 8%, or for face-to-face 44%, and it's costing us hundreds of thousands of pounds. We could go to YouGov and get something that looks exactly the same. We don't know whether it's any different because there's no criterion. Is a low response rate survey better than a well-designed quota, or is a high response rate survey better than a low response rate one? We've also got, of course, hand in hand with this is increasing costs. Per achieved interview costs for random surveys are high and increasing. I was at a presentation at APOR in the States last year. Simon Jackman, one of the directors of the National Election Study, he calculates that for each interview in the American National Election Study, it costs $2,000 per person. Okay, that's high. Their costs are higher in the US because of the geographical dispersion. They have to fly interviewers and put them up in hotels and rental cars and so on. Ours are lower. There's my estimate. Again, I imagine people will be saying, oh, that's rubbish. Where did he get that from? My estimate is about 250 quid for a face-to-face PAF sample, one adult selected, about 45 minutes, response rate about 50%, something like that. So it's around that kind of level, depending on how long the interview, what the topic is, and so on. It's hard to come up with a single figure. So our costs are low, but are certainly still very high. And we compare that to about £5 or less for opt-in panel per complete. I mean, those tend to be shorter, but then you can do a shorter interview for an online panel. If you've spent £200,000 doing a cross-sectional survey, knocking on doors, you're not going to do an interview for 5 minutes, are you? So there's a reason why some of the interview lengths are longer. And here's another quote from Cathie Marsh back in the 80s. A good quality survey, i.e. a random one, can cost 2 to 3 times as much as an inferior version of the same thing. So you look at the change in the ratio of the costs from a good to a less good quality survey, how that's changed over 30 years. What's driving this? Well, we're going back more often to the same addresses, increasing calls. We're going back to people who initially refused, converting refusals. Here's a chart from a paper from Public Opinion Quarterly, looking at the US Survey of Consumer Attitudes, where the response rate stayed pretty constant over from 1979 to 1996. But if you look at the number of calls made, essentially doubling, and the number of refusal conversions. So we're maintaining response rates, but only by investing a lot more effort and incentives. Increasingly, we're having to pay incentives as standard, and those incentives are getting higher. Here's another ballpark estimate for a random face-to-face survey. To get the last 20% of respondents, around 30 to 40% of fieldwork costs go on that last 20%. Again, this is a number that's been given to me by someone who I trust, who works in the survey industry. But again, people may have different views on that number, but it is approximately correct. And it's worth noting as well, it's not just cost, but as we put more and more pressure on people to be in surveys, we may be recruiting people who, they take the incentive, they get converted, but they give us really poor quality data. And we're even putting pressure to the point of interviewers fabricating data, agencies fabricating data in the PISA study, or respondents in web surveys as evidence from the Community Life Survey of making up fake interviews to get the incentive. And there is the other question, is this ethical research practice? People have a right to privacy and so on. And is it worth it to keep on pursuing this last 20%? And we know, here's a famous chart from a paper by Bob Groves where he looks at the correlation between bias and response rate. So as response rate goes up on the x-axis, we should be seeing a kind of a line. We could put a line going up this way, right? So that as response rate goes up, going this way, I beg your pardon, the other way. As the non-response rate, that would be right. But so we would expect the lines to go down. Of course, you don't see any pattern there. And there are other studies which have shown the same thing. Edelman et al. Looking at the response rate to exit poll surveys, no correlation with the actual prediction of the election. Keita et al. Comparing a low response rate to a high response rate survey of the same questionnaire, no difference. We tend to find if we try and predict whether people are going to respond to surveys or not, we get very low R-squared. The models are very unpredictive. This actually could be because the response propensity is kind of stochastic, not related to very much. So what if we didn't bother with these people? And this is something that we've been speculating about. And this is some work that I've done jointly with Ian Brunton-Smith, who's here, and Joel Williams. Here's some response rates to some well-known surveys. And we're looking at there's the call number along the bottom, and you can see the response rate goes up as you make more calls. And what we're saying is this lot below about 50%, that's about 60% of your costs, and that is 40% of your costs. So what if you just stopped here, said, let's not bother? Now, you wouldn't just be able to do that because you wouldn't have a big enough sample size. So you'd have to issue more sample in the first place, but you could essentially take more out of this easy section. Now, we'd be worried about doing that because we think these people are different. That's why we pursue the high response rates. But is that true? Well, what we've done in this big study is let's take a single variable and say percentage of people who smoke. So let's say that's 24% after one call, after the people you get after one call, and compare that estimate to what you get after you've made all the calls. You've chased all these people and done refusal conversion and so on. Let's say it's 18%. So the absolute difference there is 6%. You could also take a relative absolute difference, but we're looking at this difference here. And we don't just do that for one variable, we do that for over 600 variables over 6 different surveys, and we model all of this. So what does that look like? What's the average across all those 600 variables? Well, this is all of the variables. Each point represents a different variable. The average is 1.8 percentage point after one call when the response rate is very low. If you put post-stratification weights on that, it goes down even lower. I mean, you still be worried about some of these here, but the average is pretty low. After 3 calls, it's flattened out a lot more. You've still got a few out here on the tail, but when you post-stratify, down to 0.6 percentage points. Okay? And when you go up to 5 calls, it's even flatter, as you can imagine. But we're going up to 10, 12 calls sometimes and refusal conversions. So the lesson to take from that is I think that there isn't a great deal of value to be gained from chasing these people down and putting all that resource into these final respondents. So here's the bit where I speculate about the future, some things I think might happen and some things I'd like to happen. One thing I think we need to do is to be more tolerant of low response rates. Okay, we need to escape from the mindset of contracting a 65% response rate and always doing that. Sometimes we'll need to do that depending on the survey, but we need to be able to make decisions that say this time we can probably go for 30%. We need that. Part of that then will result in greater diversity. At the moment, your choices are kind of very expensive or very cheap. We need to have more diversity, and we need to have a better understanding of what you get for your money. If you spend more, what do you get? We should continue to be wary of opt-in panels. I think the evidence shows here that they are, they're useful, they have their uses, but for official statistics and for academic surveys, they are problematic. There's a quote I like from Bob Grove: such designs work well until they don't. There is little theory underlying their key features, and there's increasing evidence of substantial bias. So we need to continue to be wary. I think the future is also going to be about the internet, but it's going to have to be about random internet surveys. These are increasingly being developed. The methods are still finding their way. We don't have one in the UK. There are several internationally. But certainly the future, you draw a random sample of people, recruit them to the panel, and then they undertake periodic surveys. The fixed costs are very high, but the marginal cost of an interview is very low. And increasingly, we need to be able to do surveys differently to respond to people's use of new technology, smartphones, and so on. So I thought actually at this point it would be nice to have a picture of a white boat on a blue sea, because it's so unpleasant outside. But no, there is a reason for this, which is this is more wishful thinking than what I think is actually going to happen. But there's a possibility that we'll get the sailing ship effect here, and this is an idea from Science and Technology Studies, which is that the acceleration of innovation in the old technology in response to the threat from the new. Okay, so in a good future, we may get a sailing ship effect for random in-home surveys as they become increasingly uncommon. I mean, in the early days of surveys, the response rates used to be 90-odd%. The first surveys that were done, they were calculated because people were like, "Oh, you want to interview me, the government? Wow, that's great." And that has become so common to be asked to do surveys that people just say no routinely now. So we may see a slight resurgence. But it's also to say that we can't go down the route of everything being low response rates. That's not my argument. I think my argument is that we need to have greater diversity. We need to have a middle market where there are lower response rates but still random, but probably some of the big government surveys, the crime survey, etc., will still need to chase down those respondents. Okay, so to finish, on a positive note again, I think that reports of the death of random surveys are greatly exaggerated. Anyone know who this is? Angus Deaton, not the disgraced television compere. And anyone know what he did? You're not allowed to answer. No one. He won the Nobel Prize for Economics, and he's most famous for this book, The Analysis of Household Surveys. And so I think if in 2015 the Nobel Prize for Economics is going to someone who analyses household surveys, there's plenty of life in the old dog yet. Thank you. Sorry. Yes.
I think what I will do is I will sit here We've only got one lapel mic between us, so rather than Patrick take it on and off, I will sit here. And I will just very quickly, actually, go through some of the slides that I prepared so that we can leave enough time for discussion. What I'm going to do, of course, is agree with Patrick on a lot of things. However, and I want to emphasise just a few points that he made. First is just to remember that the italics, if you can read there, this distinction, so-called distinction between polls and surveys. Polls are low-quality, non-random. Surveys are high-quality, random. Polls are about democracy. Surveys about explanation, understanding. First thing that struck me was that equating, if that's right. Oh God, is that you? Yeah. Okay. That equating low quality and democracy seems quite an interesting juxtaposition. And in thinking about what is the purpose of both the polls and surveys, we might come back to that if we can get the slide back. The one other comment that I would make, this is very... Let me carry on talking anyway. Because one of the things that, again, Patrick's comments prompted me to think about was just what a brutal world polling is. That actually, there they were, all being tested very publicly within a few days of their polls being published. Of course, those of us in the survey research world don't very often get exposed to that kind of challenge. But one thing that Patrick didn't say, but it's worth remembering, is that even the best designed random probability survey with the most unfeasibly low levels of non-response will sometimes get it wrong. They will sometimes get it wrong. The difference is that we often don't know that. And we certainly don't know it for quite a long time. So, let me also comment on one of your conclusions, which is that that actually the implications for surveys may be minimal, I think was your phrase. I think it would be a bit of a shame to waste a good crisis, particularly when it was the polling industry's crisis. It would be a shame for the survey research community not actually to take that very seriously and to think hard about, okay, so what can we learn about this? And you've talked about sampling, you've talked about internet access, but I wanted to talk about one or two other things. Still not got these slides back. Let me tell you what it would say if you could see it. The first one would talk about the polls themselves. And you showed the growth in a couple of slides. The 1,942 polls for GB in the 5-year period before this election, compared with just 3,500 in the whole of the preceding half century. That's a startling growth. And part of that can be explained, as you did, by the supply side. These are faster, cheaper, easier to do than ever before. But presumably part of it is also on the demand side. People pay for these things for a reason. The reason, I suspect, I don't know, may actually be very different. That if The Guardian is right, that actually it impacts on both voting behaviour for individuals, but also political behaviour by politicians. We saw the YouGov poll before the Scottish referendum, and the stories about how the predicted closeness of that referendum led to the spectacle of politicians from Whitehall up and down to Edinburgh and Glasgow and changing the tone of the debate based on a poll, maybe on more than one polls. But if it does have that impact on political behaviour, and if it does change our individual voting intentions, seeing what we think other people are going to do and how they're going to vote, then presumably this link with democracy is real. And presumably you can understand why there may be proposals for regulation. I'll come on to that a bit as well. However, actually, I think another reason for commissioning these is that they are so cheap, and they do fill a gap in broadcasting and in column inches. And they are there as talking points, not as any necessarily serious attempt either to predict or to say what voting intention is on any one at any one point of time. And I wondered how that kind of range of purposes, I actually wondered what the commissioners thought. What do they think they're getting when they commission a poll, and do they know what they're getting? And with another hat on at the moment, I'd be really interested in what do the pollsters report themselves in terms of methodology, back to transparency and methodology. What do they say to users about how their poll should be used and the limitations? And yeah, that's the slide. If they are fully transparent and explain exactly what the limitations are, how does that get reported by the media? One or two other points about regulation. We saw the draft bill that Patrick said has got committee stage this week, and it talked about regulation. If there is a case for regulation, you may want to discuss. What's it going to regulate? It talks in the bill about sampling methods, question wording, publication in the run-up to an election. In other words, should the polls be allowed to publish in the week or the 10 days or the 2 weeks before an election or a referendum? We've heard that debated. But actually, those of us who are in the survey world and have codes of practice and quality frameworks, actually those quality frameworks and codes of practice cover other things. They do cover things about transparency of methods and about expressing the limitations and about helping users. And most of all, they also talk about expectations of publication. And one of the things that, again, Patrick mentioned was that of all those numerous polls, I wonder how many of them actually were published. What about private polling in this? If private polling is the thing that actually the politicians take notice of, then should we not be distinguishing that kind of private polling from the more public reporting of polls? Are they different? I don't know. But you can well imagine an argument that says, like for clinical trials, if you are collecting data from the public, however that's being collected, then there is an expectation of publication. That would put an end to the private polls. I can't imagine anybody actually supporting that. But I think there's questions to be asked about what regulation might look like. I won't go over this, except to say that you mentioned 1992. Many of us were here in 1992 and remember the discussions after the 1992 polls. One of the things I will say is that your Cluedo set really did look like the usual suspects to me. Now, some may have more or less importance than others, but that raises the question, is solving the problem of what went wrong in 2015 actually the right question? Isn't the right question, what could go wrong in the EU referendum next year, or in the general election in 2020, or in any other elections? How is the world changing? How is technology changing? How are people responding to polls? How is that likely to change? And what are the kinds of methods and solutions that we need for the future. Just again, a few words on surveys. Patrick demonstrated declining response rates, global phenomenon, except I think only one or two countries I know of where that's not happening. And he's challenged us to think, does response matter as much as we think? And I go back to this, what are surveys for? That, quoting Cathie Marsh, Patrick talked about understanding. For explanation and understanding. What that often means is that actually we're not always terribly interested just in the point estimates. We're not just interested in the average. We are interested in distributions, inequalities, relationships. And those relationships between variables are often the very thing that you can't post-stratify for. Should we be ready to accept lower response rates? I happen to think throughout my career, maybe naive, that actually official surveys, well conducted, well designed on random probability surveys, they are actually about democracy. That they are about making sure that all the groups in our society, including the hard to get, have their experiences represented. Now, I absolutely accept the point you make about, we spend an awful lot of time and money increasingly on chasing the hard to get respondents. Should we be ready to give up on them? And again, I think I agree with Patrick's plea that actually to answer that question, you need a much better understanding on the part of commissioners and users of what is it that the questions that they're trying to answer and what would it be appropriate method. And you need a range of offerings. But I want to say one or two more things about that. The other thing I would say is don't forget the interviewers. That Patrick talked about being able to kind of ratchet up from your menu of higher response rate to lower response rates. I wonder, in any single agency, it may mean that what we're looking at is a fragmentation of the industry. Because I wonder whether actually that's possible within a single agency to do. Those agencies that run large field forces of interviewers, where those the culture, the DNA, is about maximising response rate, that starts on day one from when an interviewer is recruited and trained. In fact, they're often rewarded. They're paid according to how efficiently they can track down those hard-to-get respondents. As soon as, and there have been some experiments on this, you start saying to them, actually, we're going to reward you and pay you, and on this particular occasion, 3 calls will do, say, then it's extremely difficult to ratchet up and ratchet down. So just a practical note. I also wonder in your work whether actually the 50% that you would get, where there was a limit on the number of calls of say 3, would be the same 50% that you get where there is a much higher number, i.e. those comparisons that you're making. I suspect there might be a compositional effect of actually making the operational change. We've talked about this. The one other thing I would add, very expensive, very cheap as the current offerings. Actually, one of the things that I used to hear about a lot is that one of the increasingly important dimensions in this is timeliness. It's not just cost and it's also and quality defined as the ability to draw inferences from probability samples. It's also to do with timeliness, and the traditional face-to-face survey is never ever going to be very very timely or cost effective. So I agree, a diversity of offerings, but what are the implications for the industry in that? Should we care about that? And finally, because you mentioned it, and because you cannot these days be in a room at the RSS without mentioning big data, and you didn't, you said, you know, good luck to those who think that Twitter can do some of the things that polls do. Well, actually, I'd like to see that. I'd like to know, how did Twitter or Google Trends or other data sources and analytics actually do, if we'll ever know, because they probably don't publish an awful lot of it, but I would like to know. I'd also like to know, thinking about your model of more diverse offerings, what role do new non-traditional data sources have in that? Either for calibration or as part of a reweighting or post-stratification system. So, they were just the points that kind of struck me, and a lot of it, as Patrick said, is about what are these things for. They were summarizes what I've said. I'm going to shut up now and hand over to you. Any questions on anything, not just the points that I've raised, would be extremely welcome. There are some mics for whoever, so wait for the mics to come. Questions, comments are welcome. Please say who you are.
I was told there'd be 2 microphones.
Can you check, well, I need it as well. So we've just got one roving microphone. Can we also have Nick's? Okay, we'll manage with this up here then. Okay, I've got 2 hands to start with. Nick, you were first. So pass it. No, start with you. Start with you, Nick, because you were the first.
Yeah, Nick Moon from GFK. I mean, Pat would be disappointed, I know, if I didn't take issue with him in a number of ways, but actually I'm somewhat limited in how much I can do, because I thought, I was very enormously impressed by what he said, particularly by the way he pulled the standard undergraduate essay trick of answering the question he wanted to rather than the one he actually been asked. The beginning bit was asking that, and then he went off into really interesting stuff, which was actually quite different. But a couple of serious, the other point to make is that I should warn you, Pat, there's actually some doppelganger of yours going around the place, because you said at the beginning that random surveys are what people like you do. There's some other Pat Sturgis I've seen at APA a whole series of times giving papers based on shitty old omnibus surveys done with quota methods, so you probably want to have a word with him for damaging your brand. And also, when it comes to damaging brands, I was interested, you said that, that official statistics might be damaged by the polling failures. Well, after seeing the recent debacle about the official statistics on police funding, I think it's the other way around. I think the official statistics are actually damaging survey research. But the two kind of serious points really are that, yes, BES did fantastically well, and we're enormously proud of having done that, and at considerably less than £250 an interview too. You can look it up. It was well cheaper than that. But we achieved this fantastic result of getting the recall vote pretty much as much as you could hope, and a 56% response rate on the back of 3 months field work. And that's kind of not really going to be very practical for a election campaign. And yes, I know you're going to say you could have a random panel and dip into it. But even if we're going to restrict the number of polls in some way, because we did have a ridiculous number, you can't dip into that many times. So I'm afraid it's not the answer. We're going to have something other than that. It's going to carry on being quota or whatever. It's going to carry on being online or whatever. Jill made the point about Google Trends. I know that some people did actually use Google Trends, and they were wildly wrong as well. They basically came out just as badly wrong as anybody. I mean, there may have been other people out there doing it, but Google Trends, the one survey I saw doing that, was actually just as badly wrong. Well, the final point, looking to the future, sort of Pat's sailing ship model, I think, the industry will be changing, and probably more than we can possibly imagine. And I think where it's going to change more than we can really think, and it's changing actually at the moment without us noticing, I think, and is in the way online surveys work. We talk about online panels and online panel providers and all this kind of thing. YouGov, I know, are a very special model. I can't speak for the other pollsters using panels, but I can certainly speak for the market research agencies that are using panels. They're buying in panel from a number of 3 or 4 suppliers who supply the whole industry, who are not running panels at all. What we're actually getting is a whole variety of different ways of finding ways of making people take part in surveys. And that's a bad thing in the sense we've really got no idea what's going on, but it's a good thing in the sense we're not actually restricted to people just signing up for panels anymore, that suddenly the person who doesn't want to be in a panel has got their chance to take part in a survey. And I think that the way online panels or online surveys work will change enormously over the next few years, and what we think of as wrong now may be completely different by then.
Thank you. I think you can probably hear me. I'll take 2 or 3, not too many.
I'll never remember them.
Can I'll just say something about that. I mean, on the first point, yeah. I mean, I'm being facetious. Sometimes I do use non-random surveys, but on the other point about whether random is the answer, and Jill touched on this, that just saying we're going to draw random samples, I don't think is the answer. I think there are other reasons. Certainly, within the current kind of constraints of the way that we do random samples, it's not feasible. I don't think I quite agree with and I wasn't quite sure why it wouldn't be feasible in the future, where we had how do we know what the future is going to be like? I think the BES analysis is quite interesting, what they've done to show, and it kind of goes against what I've been saying, which is we don't need to chase down these hard to get ones. What they're showing in their analysis is that as the response rate increases, the lead of the Conservatives in the BES was going up, so they were getting more and more Conservatives as they were making more and more calls, more effort, and these were the ones that were being missed. And the polls were getting the kind of the feckless Labour supporters sitting around at home, waiting to be interviewed, and the BES was good. So I don't think it's a solution. I think as in almost any kind of question about is random better than and particularly low response rate random, it's kind of always going to be better theoretically. In practical terms, it may not be.
Okay, I've got, right now, loads, so I'm not going to take them all in one go, but we'll have a couple of rounds. Guy in the red jumper first.
Thank you. I'm Joe Greenwood from the University of Essex. I wanted to draw on a point that Jill referred to briefly in her discussion, which was, given that I'm from the University of Essex, you can tell I'm doing academic research. The big question for me is, what are the implications for surveys where we're looking at causal or explanatory relationships rather than just observing distributions in a population? Are there different implications? Are they the same? There's competing papers that say you can pretty much trust a non-random panel survey for looking at relationships, and others that say you can't.
I'll try and say, I think I know what I'm like, and I'll forget what the question was while I'm listening to the next one. So I think that, in theoretical terms, I don't see why there would be a strong expectation that what we're talking about is a conditional, a marginal association. It would be any less prone to selection effects than a univariate distribution. So on the other hand, the evidence does seem to suggest that they are more robust, and that goes back to my other point about that Nick was picking me up on, is that the papers that you've seen me doing at APOR with non-random samples are ones where, with Nick Allen at the back there, where we've done a lot of stuff with experiments in surveys, and then you can, I think your randomization is in the experiment rather than in the drawing of the sample. But I think, so theoretically I don't see any strong reason to assume that's the case, but there does seem to be some empirical evidence which suggests that for associations, for models, that these are more robust.
Thank you. There was somebody there. You've still got your hand up? Yeah, guy in blue shirt.
Martin? No? Just go for it.
I'm a bit surprised, Andy, I'm a bit surprised that academics are now sort of questioning pollsters when, for example, at the LSE back in March, there was a seminar and lecture in which all of the pollsters gave their figures. There was an august audience, and there was really no response and no questioning of the validity of the data. So this all seems a bit after the event. I wonder if you could comment.
Sorry, what the it is after the event, yes. I mean, oh, I see. Oh well, we did actually do a pre-election event where we talked with the pollsters about what their methods were, and that was when Nick Moon made his prediction about the 20-year cycle. So we were thinking about it, and so this follows on from that. I wouldn't say that we have only looked at it after the event, but we certainly didn't predict it, if that's what you mean.
Yeah, Paul Kiff. I work for an organisation. I don't want to name it because I might be seen as trying to market it. But we do training of people who are in both the social and market research industry. And what I've noticed is that the demand for our services is expanding exponentially. And we're increasingly meeting people who are students who describe themselves as head of research, head of customer insight. And when you try to train them in the standards of any of the national bodies that try to promote good quality research, you're constantly told, we don't do that in our industry. The people who own the businesses do not want to accept good quality standards of research.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, that's something that we hear a lot about. Actually, coming from universities, that we produce graduates that don't have the requisite skills for what the job market requires. But I'm not sure I've got a solution to that problem.
We've got two at the front, Graham.
Martin Boone from ICM. The thing about pollsters, of course, is that even when we're wrong, we're right. And I think I always like now and actually enjoy the accusation that we heard it, because our final poll was obviously quite disappointing, but I was quoted in the Independent on Sunday 4 days beforehand suggesting that the Tories would win 36-32, so credited with being the most accurate pollster rather than most accurate polling, which is, I suppose, some kind of gratification. However, Patrick, I wish you'd advised me that we shouldn't have needed to chase our hard-to-reach respondents on that final poll, because I watched it on a daily basis when we started interviewing on the Sunday and looked at it on the Monday morning, the Tuesday morning. And the Tory lead that we started out with dissipated as we chased those hard-to-reach groups, typically the 18 to 24s. I'm being serious. The 18 to 24s, actually the C1, C2 social grades, which we seemingly across the industry failed to achieve quotas for on an ongoing basis. And actually we exacerbated that problem by chasing those people, by also ending up with not enough of them and therefore weighting them up. And those bastards, they split the wrong way in our final poll. So had you have said to me, don't bother with those day 3 and day 4, we would have come out looking all right. So I'll be coming for you afterwards.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment on sort of a bit historical here, but in the mid-70s, late 70s, there was a poll that went completely wrong there, and the Market Research Society spent a lot of time and published a very long dissertation on this, and I couldn't see that point on your graph, but so I mean this has been going on for, that was mid-70s, that was 40 years ago that my misfortune was to be on the Market Research Council at that time. But the other thing, sir, I felt, listening to you, I think you're far too sympathetic towards the polling companies. I mean, there's something, you can call them shysters if you like, but I think that you were far too sympathetic towards those people. And just to go back further in time, the eminent ex-chairman of the Royal Statistical Society, Professor Maurice Kendall, held a meeting in the RSS, and he developed a cube law where he took the population and he was trying to predict the division of amongst parties by using this cube law. So this goes back a long time, but it doesn't really sound to me as if they're making much progress from the mid-70s when I had to read and work on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any others? Yeah. Oh, right. I'm just not engaged.
Let me just quickly take.
How long? Let me
yeah,
just see how
I'll be
many
quick.
there are.
There's a lot.
There's 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Patrick, you
Yeah, on Martin's point, it's a good one, and I think actually one of the other things to say is that one of the interesting developments recently in survey methodology is more adaptive designs, and that's kind of what you're talking about. So you're not just sort of saying we'll take a 30% response rate and stop. You stop at 30% if you're looking at your distributions and they're kind of okay, So I think it's a bit of a mix of the two, of accepting low risk, but sometimes it will matter more than others, and if you've got things that you can look at. On the point about being too nice to pollsters, I can only apologise for that. I've approached this from someone who's not involved in polling. As I said, I find it's a difficult job that they do. They do it generally pretty well. The errors that they make. I mean, if I were to have some kind of criticism of a generic nature, it would probably be that and this is both sides, the media, the clients, and the pollsters. They're involved in a cycle of overstating the precision of these things. But they've both got a stake to say we can get this right on the money. And one of the reasons why the Guardian were very cross, I think, was because they invested the polls with a greater level of accuracy than they're capable of. They really should. The Guardian should be aware that this is a possibility, that the polls are sometimes wrong, and the pollsters probably are overemphasising how accurate their polls are. But I think the 20-year rule, the Moon 20-year rule, is almost you would expect this because what you're always having to base a lot of these decisions on what happened last time. You can't get away from that. If you've got to make decisions about how likely are people to turn out to vote, what to do with don't knows, all these kinds of things, those are, you don't know what's going to happen this time. You have to base it on what happened last time. And so there's almost a built-in potential for failure, or high potential for failure anyway, I think.
Kirby Swales from NatSen. It was a really, really good talk. Lots of interesting things. Lots of things I agree with, and particularly the idea of being more tolerant of low response rates. I've got one comment and then sort of one question about the sort of international scene, really. So the comment is, it seems to me like surveys, both polls and random, want it both ways. They want to promote themselves as being very useful, but then also when things go wrong, they retreat back to the confidence intervals, the margins of error. So I suppose I spend my time trying to persuade clients not to present results to 1 percentage point, to understand the vagueness. And so the question is, how can we persuade everyone to understand what surveys really are for, which is kind of broader changes in populations, not the kind of fine-grained detail, which leads me on to the kind of what more could be done. Is could we use admin data linkage more? Could we use more coverage surveys to really validate some of the survey estimates that are most important? So that's the sort of comment piece. The question is, you mentioned international polling inquiries that have been done in the context of not getting the data. So I'd be interested to know what examples there are and what's come out of them. And you also mentioned America restricting now RDD surveys for mobiles. But I've also heard that America's thinking about bringing in the fact that internet poll activity is paid work. So effectively, you have to start paying the minimum wage for online panels. And I just wonder if there's any truth in that, but also what is the ethics of the move to online polling? Because I think that is the real story here.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there have been, Mario gave me this book when I came in, the pre-election polls of 1948.
and the 19th. So there have been a long series of inquiries of this nature, because what tends to happen is we have a number of elections where things are fine, or indeed the other point to make is that oftentimes the pollsters are kind of off, but they call it right. Okay, so and no one cares then. I mean, if they'd all been, if they'd all herded to the right answer, we wouldn't be talking about herding now. So I think there is a long history of these kinds of inquiries. There's a long history of political interest in them, and our discussions about regulation and banning of polls before election periods and so on. Most of which I think is misguided. I mean, the idea that you could, how would you frame legislation around banning doing polls that you don't publish? I can't, you could potentially do something around banning publication of polls, but how would you stop people asking people questions? I mean, that's what we do as human beings. So I think, there's a lot of confused thinking, and I don't think there's ever going to be any sensible legislation based around this. I mean, the transparency issue, I think, is an interesting one. In the US, it's led to a transparency initiative that's being led by APOR, which is effectively saying if you want to be part of what would in this country be the BPC, or in the US would be APOR, you have to adhere to these set of transparency criteria, and they're sort of building it up that way. And as I said, fortunately in this context, perhaps because we're a smaller country, a smaller group of pollsters, we haven't experienced that kind of pushback. But who knows in the future? Yeah.
And no idea if that. I'd never heard that rumour about minimum wage or living wage for people participating in surveys. That would be that's a new one, really. There were three others. There was
Nicole Martin. I work for Understanding Society, and I spend a lot of my time trying to convince policymakers and civil servants to use a nationally representative, high-quality, face-to-face survey. And one of the things that we've encountered since May is people in these positions, including someone whose job is an analyst, saying to us, well, we can't trust your data, look at what happened with the polls. So I have to say I'm more on the side of you're being a bit too kind to the pollsters and the election forecasters as well, because it has consequences for the rest of us. So what would you say to a civil servant who came back, who said that to you when you're trying to convince them to use high quality data?
Well, I'd probably show him some of my slides that where I said there's not such a strong read over between these. Again, the Understanding Society is not trying to predict what people are going to, who they're going to vote for in next year's referendum. Understanding Society uses very different methodologies and so on. I think actually one of the other points that I didn't really emphasise in my case, the sort of the sailing ship effect, is that I think in addition to having more diversity in terms of response rates, quality, and knowing what you're getting, is that we also have to make the case that sometimes you need to spend a hell of a lot of money to do this really, really well. If the most important things, the jewels in the crown, are going to cost a lot of money, and you can't cut back. If you it's always going to be, with response rates, it's about minimising risk, because we don't know what the true value is 99% of the time. So it's always going to be saying, do you want to spend this extra money to reduce the risk, often by an unknown quantity? And that's a hard sell to commissioners, particularly when there's so little money around. And so, yeah, I think we still have to continue to make the case for investing a lot of money in some surveys, but increasing the diversity, knowing more about what the variability in response rates does in terms of those risks.
I would say two things. One is, do you really want to make public policy on the basis of the kinds of performance that the polls had, i.e. turn it back to them? That's why you are costing a lot more and taking a lot longer. The second thing I'd do is I'd give the name of that analyst to my successor, John Pullinger, and say, have a word.
Hi, Peter Martin, UCL. I just wonder, for me, the real disquiet is, and I have the greatest respect for scientific survey research, I've worked in it myself in the past, but the real disquiet is that in the polls there's a situation where companies are really doing their best to try and predict something, that where there's an external criterion for then finding out later whether you're right or wrong, and you're finding out you're wrong. And most of the time when we do surveys, we try to estimate quite subtle things like people's attitudes, people's perceptions, people's reports on other people, and we don't have an external criterion. And often we estimate, on the basis of these data, we try to estimate quite subtle effects, relationships between attitudes, predictions of attitudes, and so forth. And usually we don't have an external criterion, and we're calculating confidence intervals and p-values, on the basis of ignoring survey non-response, ignoring possible measurement bias that might exist, and so forth. So isn't that the real challenge that the failure of the polls poses to us?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's fortunately in most of almost all the work that I do, there's no chance of being shown to be wrong, which is a nice position to be in most of the time. And interestingly, actually, George Gallup, who I spoke to earlier, sort of pioneer of polling, was of the view that actually the election side of polling was really not important at all. He was a big advocate of opinion polling and the voice of the people being reflected back to politicians. But for him, the election polling was really a way of refining methodologies, because it was one of the only chances that you had where you've got an external criterion. I think we do have external criteria that are imperfect, of course. In the work that I was of my own that I was showing, where we have to use a random survey with a high response rate as the benchmark, but oftentimes that's all we've got.
Thank you. Finally, Pam.
Pam Campanelli. So we've talked about response rates and not so much about non-response bias. And I just wanted to say that what I think people really should be thinking through is who's likely to be underrepresented in certain circumstances, whether it's 3 calls or we have a much higher response rate, who's going to be underrepresented, and is that actually related to the topic? So it shouldn't be just something blanket over all surveys. So obviously if we're going to, let's say, underrepresent men compared to women, that would make a big difference in a health survey, but it might make no difference in other surveys. So I just wanted to make that distinction.
Thank you. And Patrick, and your final word?
I'll just say that, I mean, yeah, it's not nice to be asked that question by Pam, because the first ever presentation I did here was when I was working for you in SCPR, Pam, so that's a nice circularity to end with. But I agree, and the other problems that I think you picked out, some of the issues that if we just did this, what if we stopped after 3 calls, that's problematic for kind of field issues, and would it work, and you don't just want to do it arbitrarily because it depends on and and the other thing that we're aware of is that interviewers might behave differently, of course. We're assuming that this is how an interviewer would behave if interviews were capped at 1 call or 2 calls. They would probably adopt different strategies, but nonetheless I think it's an interesting thought experiment, and it does tell you something about quite informative. When you look over a very, very large number of variables and a very large number of surveys, it does tell you something quite interesting about what the gain is by getting 10, 20, 30 percentage points higher on the response rate, often very small.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for your questions, and thank you to Patrick. This will not be the end of these discussions, I'm sure, and you will have a big audience here in January.